Hi, my pen name is Eel, and today I would like to talk about the thought filter model that I use to help people understand how my plural mind works. Most people will agree that the mind has two parts. The subconscious part, represented here as the area outside the blue circle, and the conscious part, represented by the blue circle. Most will also agree that both parts are involved in creating thoughts. One question most people do not ask is, what determines who owns that thought? The answer, our subconscious. So I will draw a red circle around our conscious mind to represent this function, and we will call this circle the thought assignment filter. Most people feel that most thoughts are theirs. So for our presentation, we will call this part of the filter that assigns ownership of thoughts to a singular sense of self as the my part of the filter. Now let's illustrate how a thought comes to be. First, work occurs in our subconscious mind that comes prior to a conscious thought. We will call this a pre-thought. Once this pre-thought is ready to be a thought, the thought assignment filter labels this thought, and then the thought manifests into the conscious mind as a thought. However, since thought ownership is a key part of being plural, we should label the thought as a my thought for clarity later on. To start understanding how a plural mind works, we will start with a phenomenon that most have experienced: intrusive thoughts. These are usually morally reprehensible or unwanted thoughts that leave us wondering, why am I thinking that? More importantly, it may leave us feeling like they are not our thoughts. To model this, I will start with a pre-intrusive thought, which works just like a pre-thought, but instead of the thought assignment filter assigning it as our own thought, this pre-intrusive thought enters our conscious mind without being assigned and becomes an intrusive thought. Sarah Anderson illustrates this phenomena in episode 160 of her comic. Notice how she decides to represent her intrusive thought as coming outside of herself, as if she did not own it. Another example of other owned thoughts arise when some people practice inner family systems therapy, or IFS. Richard Swartz, the founder of inner family systems therapy, postulates that the mind is not singular, but is in fact made of multiple parts, and with a few simple techniques, clients can communicate with those parts. To start, let's rename some terms to fit the IFS model. First, instead of a pre-thought, we will start with a parts blended pre-thought. Here's a good spot to introduce the concept of blending. When a part is blended with a client, any thought that part generates feels like a my thought. However, via simple IFS techniques, a client can start unblending with that part, and at some point in the session, that part's thought will no longer feel like the client's own. Rather, it will feel like that part owns its own thoughts. So we will represent that as a new segment in the thought assignment filter and call it the part filter. Since this new segment exists, all those parts pre-thoughts now appear in the conscious mind as that part's thoughts. These parts thoughts can be so distinct from a client's sense of self that it can cause a reaction in the mind. That reaction starts as a different pre-thought, goes through the my filter, and emerges in the conscious mind as a my thought. Now this my thought can be directed towards that part, and that part can respond, creating a loop where a person interacts with this part of themselves. An example of this part-client interaction is seen on episode 295 of the We Can Do Hard Things podcast. In this episode, Glennon interacts with a part related to her eating disorders. At one point, This part feels excited to be heard, which causes Glennon to react and say, "Now I feel effing crazy." There are two reasons why she says this. First, she may not have expected this reaction from the part she was working with, causing her to be genuinely surprised. Second, since thinking or feeling multiple is culturally stigmatized, a part of her, obedient to that stigma, is expressing concern that she might be mentally unwell since she is having this experience. I would argue this is a perfectly normal experience, but that argument will have to wait for another presentation. Now, to understand the plural mindset, we can start with the IFS mindset, change a few terms, and make some important distinctions. First, instead of having a part, a plural person has what's called system mates. Therefore, the subconscious creates the pre-thoughts for these system mates and assigns that pre-thought as such via that system mates part of the thought assignment filter. It is important to note that unlike IFS, where a client needs to perform certain techniques to create the parts filter segment, a plural mind automatically sets up the system mates part of the thought assignment filter. Therefore, instead of a parts thought, we get a system mates thought, which drives the same loop we saw in IFS. Now, instead of using the word my to refer to myself, I like to refer to myself as the host, mainly out of respect to the system mates that I share a mind with. Some ways IFS parts and system mates differ is that IFS parts only unblend intentionally, whereas system mates can automatically unblend. Also, IFS parts tend to be narrow in personality scope, as in they only encompass a limited set of thoughts, behaviors, beliefs, and emotions. For example, a person may have an IFS part that takes care of their usual morning routine. System mates tend to have more complex personalities, meaning they can have their own IFS parts or even capital S self. Thanks for listening, guys. I will admit this is my unprofessional opinion, and this information is based primarily on how I experience my plurality, but I use this model when explaining what the sensation of having a system mate is like to others that have not experienced anything like this. So please, let me know what your thoughts on these thoughts are.